The medicae had been stitching the same wound for 40 minutes, when I realized the flesh was stitching itself differently underneath my hands, not healing, changing. Corporal Venn lay on the surgical slab with a last burn across his ribs, the kind of injury I'd closed 1,000 times in my 15 years serving the 47th Cadian. Standard procedure: clean the carbonized tissue, seal the dermis, apply counterseptic, recite the prayer to the Emperor's mercy. My hands moved through the routine while my mind catalogued supply requisitions. Except the tissue under my needle wasn't behaving like tissue anymore. It had begun growing structures that resembled nothing in my anatomical training. Not organs, not tumors. Something that pulsed with its own geometry, unfolding in ways that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on the edges. Venn's breathing remained steady. His vital signs held normal. The anesthetic kept him under. He hadn't been near any warp-tainted zones. No psyker had brushed his mind. His last deployment had been a standard suppression operation against Orc raiders, the kind of grinding mechanized warfare that defined the Eastern Front, and he'd taken the last burn from friendly fire during a night engagement when the Vox network went down. Clean wound, clean war, clean soldier. I'd checked his records myself before surgery. 17 years of service, not a single mark of suspicion. Faith evaluations that read like ecclesiarchy propaganda, a family history so pure it could have been used in recruitment posters. The flesh continued its transformation while I worked. New architectures bloomed beneath my sutures. I could feel them moving, rearranging, building themselves into configurations that had no correspondence with human anatomy or xenos biology or anything I'd seen in the most restricted medical texts dealing with chaos corruption. This wasn't mutation following the patterns of Nurgle's plagues or Tsench's changes. This was something writing its own rules into reality, and Corporal Venn's body was simply the parchment it had chosen. When I finally stepped back and called for the commissar, my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't hold the scalpel. The commissar took one look at the thing on the table, the thing that still had Venn's face, and Venn's identification tags and Venn's service record, and ordered the entire medical wing sealed. They used melter charges to sterilize the room. The heat was enough to vaporize adamantium. When the smoke cleared, they found patterns burned into the floor that couldn't be scrubbed away. 3 servitors suffered catastrophic neural failure just looking at them. The commissar had the floor tiles ripped out and launched into the system's star. That was my introduction to what the Ordo Malleus would later classify as spontaneous chaotic emergence, though the classification came months after most of us who witnessed it were dead. I survived because I'd been standing behind 3 feet of reinforced rockcrete when Venn's transformation reached its conclusion. The 17 other people in that medical bay weren't as fortunate. What they became before the melter charges ended them still visits me in those moments between waking and sleep, when the mind hasn't yet remembered how to lie to itself about what's possible. The Imperium has fought chaos for 10,000 years. We know its shape, we know its methods. A cultist whispers forbidden names in the darkness, drawing converts one corrupted soul at a time until a coven forms. A sorcerer opens a rift, spilling demonic filth into real space. A Chaos Space Marine warband descends from the warp, led by champions who've spent millennia perfecting their service to the ruinous powers. There's always a vector, always a source, always someone or something that serves as the gateway between the immaterium and reality. The Inquisition has built an entire infrastructure around identifying and eliminating these vectors before corruption can spread. Trillions of humans die every year to keep those gateways sealed. It's a war of attrition that the Imperium has learned to fight, learned to survive, even if survival means feeding entire worlds into the grinder to stop a single cult from reaching critical mass. We've catalogued the signs, the 8-pointed stars scratched into walls, the forbidden texts circulating through the underhive, the whispered prayers to gods whose names corrode the soul. We hunt the witches and the heretics and the daemon-touched with a thoroughness that borders on mania because we know, we've always known, that chaos requires agency. It needs willing servants or broken minds or souls twisted by ambition and despair. Take away the agency, eliminate the vector, and you stop the corruption before it metastasizes. Except Corporal Venn had no vector, no cult affiliation, no forbidden knowledge, no exposure to warp phenomena. His transformation occurred spontaneously, reality itself deciding that the laws governing his existence would no longer apply. And he wasn't alone. The reports started filtering up through command 3 weeks after Ven's death, scattered incidents across a dozen subsectors. A rating on the Imperial Navy frigate, Undaunted, who grew a second mouth in her stomach that spoke in tongues no Imperium linguist could translate. A factory worker on Mordian whose shadow began moving independently, then achieved 3-dimensionality, then consumed him and 17 of his co-workers before someone thought to hit it with a lascannon. A planetary governor on Thraxis who woke one morning to find his wife had become something that existed in multiple states of matter simultaneously, phasing between solid and liquid and something else that the survivors couldn't adequately describe. No common denominator, no shared exposure, no pattern the Inquisition could identify. Just random human beings across vast stretches of space, suddenly subject to changes that violated every principle of real space physics and human biology. The Mechanicus tried to explain it as a virulent strain of the Obliterator virus, but the transformations didn't match any known techno-organic corruption. The flesh-metal fusion that defined Obliterator infection followed predictable patterns, turned people into walking weapon platforms that still operated according to comprehensible, if heretical, principles of matter and energy. These spontaneous transformations followed no pattern at all. Some victims grew new limbs that existed in states of quantum uncertainty. Others had their molecular structure rewritten into configurations that shouldn't maintain cohesion but did anyway, held together by principles that mocked the Omnissiah's sacred laws of physics. A few simply stopped being matter entirely, transitioning into forms of energy that couldn't be measured by any imperial technology, leaving behind spaces where reality had been edited, cut out like a section of parchment, the edges of the wound cauterized by forces unknown. I was reassigned to an inquisitorial task force 6 weeks after the Ven incident. They needed Medicae who'd witnessed the transformations firsthand, who could provide testimony and technical analysis for the growing crisis. The Inquisitor was a severe woman named Covenant, her face a map of scars earned over 80 years hunting daemon and heretic across the segmentum. She'd seen things that would shatter lesser minds. She'd walked through the ruins of worlds consumed by warp storms, stood in the presence of greater daemons, interrogated Chaos Space Marines who'd fought in the Long War since before the Imperium learned what traitor meant. Nothing in her experience had prepared her for this. She told me as much during our first briefing, her augmetic eye clicking and whirring as it processed the data streams flowing across her retinal display. The enemy had changed the rules, she said, and the Imperium was still trying to fight the old war. The briefing took place in the hold of an inquisitorial black ship, one of the psychically shielded vessels the Ordo Hereticus uses to transport blanks and untouchables, and the worst kind of heretical material. We were 3 weeks into the warp, heading toward a system called Vorathis, where an entire regiment of Astra Militarum had reportedly transformed overnight. 5,000 soldiers gone wrong in the span of hours. No warning. No heretical activity detected by the commissariat or the regimental confessor. The details were fragmentary, transmitted via astropathic choir before all communication with Vorathis ceased, but what we knew was enough to justify the deployment of an entire inquisitorial strike force. Covenant walked me through the reports while servitors sorted through mountains of physical documentation, their augmetic appendages moving with mechanical precision as they flagged incidents for cross-reference. Every report told the same essential story. Normalcy, then sudden corruption, then death or worse. No build-up, no warning signs. Just reality deciding that certain individuals would no longer operate according to the laws that governed baseline humanity. The theological implications were staggering, and the ecclesiarchy had already begun internal purges to root out any priest or confessor who dared voice the questions everyone was thinking. If chaos could manifest without volition, without the willing surrender of the soul, then what did that say about the Emperor's protection? What did it say about faith as a shield against corruption? The entire imperial creed rested on the principle that humanity's salvation lay in devotion to the God Emperor, that faith and vigilance could ward off the predations of the warp. But these spontaneous transformations suggested something far worse. They suggested that chaos had evolved beyond the need for converts, that it could simply reach into real space and rewrite individuals at random, plucking them from the Emperor's light without their consent or knowledge. It meant the war was no longer one of faith and corruption, but something closer to a cosmic lottery where anyone, anywhere, could be selected for transformation regardless of piety or purity. Covenant didn't put it in those terms. She was Inquisition, trained to think in tactical assessments and threat matrices rather than theological implications. But I could see the calculations running behind her eyes, the way she kept returning to certain data points as if repetition might reveal a pattern where none existed. She needed there to be a pattern. The entire inquisitorial apparatus depended on patterns, on the ability to identify threats and eliminate them before they metastasized. But pattern recognition requires consistency, and these transformations were defined by their inconsistency. Some victims changed over hours, others over days. A few transformed instantaneously, existence itself hiccuping as it rewrote their physical parameters. Some became things vaguely humanoid. Others became abstract concepts made flesh, ideas given form and hunger, and the desire to propagate. A handful simply disappeared, leaving behind spaces that refused to be filled, voids in reality that persisted despite the universe's apparent eagerness to abhor a vacuum. We translated back into real space 3 days later, and Vorathis was exactly as the astropathic reports suggested. Dead. Not destroyed in the conventional sense. The planet still rotated on its axis. Its atmosphere still processed sunlight into familiar blue skies. Its cities still stood with their spires reaching toward the void. But there was no Vox traffic, no heat signatures beyond the ambient temperature of urban infrastructure gradually cooling. No orbital traffic, no defense platforms broadcasting identification codes, no signs of the vibrant imperial world that had boasted a population of 60 million just 2 months prior. Covenant ordered a full auger sweep before committing to orbital insertion, and what the sensors found turned the bridge into a gallery of silent professionals trying very hard not to show fear. There were things moving down there. The auger returns couldn't properly classify them, kept tagging them as sensor ghosts or corrupted data, but the movement was undeniable. Vast shapes drifting through the streets of the capital city. Smaller forms that phased in and out of sensor range as if they existed only partially in real space. Energy readings that spiked and crashed according to no pattern the Mechanicus adepts could explain. We deployed via drop pod to a location 17 kilometers outside the capital, a small garrison outpost that had served as a staging ground for the 88th Vorathis rifles before their deployment to the front. The outpost should have been empty, skeletal crew at most, but as we descended through the atmosphere, I could see through the reinforced viewport that something had transformed the garrison into a structure that defied architectural logic. The walls curved in ways walls shouldn't curve. The towers grew at angles that suggested the presence of spatial dimensions human perception couldn't properly process. And there were growths, massive organic structures that might have been buildings or might have been living things. It was impossible to tell, erupting from the rockcrete parade ground like tumors or flowers depending on how your mind chose to interpret them. Covenant muttered a prayer to the Emperor, her voice steady despite the way her hands gripped the crash restraints hard enough to whiten her knuckles. The rest of the kill team stayed silent, professionals all, but I could see the tension in their postures, the way their fingers drifted toward weapons even though we were still 3 kilometers up and accelerating. The impact was brutal. Standard drop pod deployment, the kind of deceleration that turns your organs into paste if the grav compensation fails. We survived, which was more than could be said for 2 of the servitors who'd been loaded into the pod with us. Their augmetic systems hadn't handled the stress, overloaded and caught fire, filling the cramped interior with the stench of burning flesh and melted plasteel. Covenant ignored them, already moving to the deployment hatch, her power sword live and crackling with disruptive energy. The hatch blew with a dull thump, and we spilled out into Vorathis's afternoon sun expecting contact, expecting resistance, expecting anything but the silence that greeted us. The garrison stood 300 meters away, its transformed architecture writhing slightly in ways that suggested wind, except there was no wind, just still air that tasted of copper and something else. Something my mind refused to identify as a flavor because flavors belonged to things that existed in baseline reality. We advanced in standard formation, kill team protocols drilled into muscle memory through thousands of hours of training. Covenant took point, her rosette gleaming in the sunlight, her artificer armor marking her as Inquisition to anything with eyes to see. I stayed in the middle of the formation, Medicae gear slung across my back, las pistol in hand, because even though my job was healing, I'd learned on Gathis Prime that being able to shoot was more important than being able to stitch. The others spread out, a squad of Tempestus scions backed by an Eversor assassin whose presence made my skin crawl, backed by a Lex mechanic from the Ordo Xenos who'd been seconded to our team for reasons Covenant hadn't bothered to explain. We were 20 meters from the garrison's main gate when we saw the first body. It had been a soldier once. I could tell by the remnants of flak armor fused to what remained of its torso. But the rest was wrong. The limbs had multiplied, splitting into fractal arrays of appendages that diminished into infinity, each smaller than the last until they vanished beyond the threshold of visibility. The head had inverted, folded in on itself in a way that should have been fatal but clearly wasn't because the eyes were still moving, tracking our approach with an awareness that suggested consciousness despite the geometric impossibility of the skull containing a functional brain. Covenant put a bolt round through it without breaking stride. The mass detonation should have splattered it across 20 meters of dirt. Instead, the body absorbed the explosion, compressed it somehow, then released it as a sound that wasn't quite sound, more like the auditory equivalent of nausea. 2 of the scions went down, bleeding from their eyes and ears. The Eversor flickered forward, moving with the enhanced speed that made assassins the Imperium's apex killers, and tore the body apart with lightning claws. The pieces squirmed independently, trying to crawl back together, until the Lex mechanic bathed them in a gout of blessed promethium from her flamer. The fire didn't just burn the flesh, it burned the space around the flesh, cauterizing reality itself, leaving behind a patch of ground that looked somehow cleaner than the surrounding dirt, as if the laws of physics had been scrubbed back to their default parameters. We found more bodies as we penetrated deeper into the garrison. Not all of them were soldiers. Some had been support staff, administratum clerks, and mess hall cooks, and tech priests, assigned to maintain the outpost's equipment. All of them had transformed, each in their own unique way, following no template or pattern beyond the basic principle of wrongness. One had become a living doorway, their torso hollowed out and replaced with a threshold that opened onto somewhere else, somewhere the Scion's Auspex scanners refused to identify beyond tagging it as hostile environs. Another had fused with the rockcrete wall, their flesh spreading across the surface like lichen. But the lichen was screaming, thousands of tiny mouths opening and closing in the biomass, producing a susurrus of sound that might have been language or might have been random phonemes expelled from throats that had forgotten how speech worked. We burned everything. Covenant's orders were explicit. No survivors. No prisoners. No specimens for later study. Just cleansing fire and the Emperor's mercy delivered at the barrel of bolter and flamer. The garrison's command center was deep in the facility's heart. 3 levels underground, protected by reinforced blast doors and void shields that should have made it proof against anything short of orbital bombardment. The shields were down when we arrived. The blast doors had been opened from the inside, gaping wide like a mouth waiting to be fed. Covenant stopped us at the threshold, her augmetic eye cycling through spectra, scanning for heat, radiation, psychic resonance, anything that might warn us what waited below. The scanners gave her nothing. Just empty corridors, standard temperature, no energy signatures beyond the emergency lighting strips running along the ceiling. She sent the Eversor in first, because if there's an ambush waiting, the assassin is the most likely to survive it, and we followed in her wake, descending into darkness broken only by the dim red glow of emergency power. The command center's main operations room looked like someone had been in the middle of a routine briefing when the change happened. Officers sat in their stations, slumped over consoles, hands still on keyboards. The hololithic display in the room center still projected a tactical map of Vorathis, complete with unit positions and threat assessments. Everything looked normal until you noticed the details. The officers weren't breathing. They'd been dead for weeks, but their bodies hadn't decayed. Instead, they'd crystallized, flesh turning to something that resembled glass or ice or neither. Translucent material through which you could see internal structures that no longer matched human anatomy. Their organs had rearranged themselves into new configurations, forming patterns that the Lex Mechanic immediately flagged as non-Euclidean geometry. She started taking picked captures, her augmetic implants whirring, until Covenant ordered her to stop, because just looking at the patterns too long made your nose bleed. We found the garrison commander in his office, sealed behind a door he'd apparently welded shut from the inside. It took the Scions 15 minutes to cut through with a plasma torch, and when we finally breached the room we discovered why he'd locked himself in. He'd been trying to document everything, writing reports in longhand because the Vox network was down and he needed to leave some record for whoever came after. The reports covered every surface, scrawled on walls and floor and ceiling, thousands of words describing in clinical detail how his soldiers had started changing. He'd been methodical about it, noting times and symptoms and progression rates, trying to find some pattern that would explain why Private Helms had grown a second head while Sergeant Court had simply dissolved into constituent atoms that refused to disperse. The writing covered 3 weeks of observations, ending abruptly with a final note that read, "It's starting. I can feel it in my teeth." The commander's body sat at his desk, head down on the surface, one hand still holding the stylus he'd been using to write. Whatever had started in his teeth had apparently finished, because the body we found wasn't entirely physical anymore. Parts of it phased in and out of visibility, existing sometimes as flesh and sometimes as something else, some state of being that human perception couldn't properly classify. Covenant read through all of it, every scrawled word, her face growing progressively more grim as she absorbed the garrison commander's documentation. When she finished, she drew her bolt pistol and destroyed the body with a single shot, then ordered the room burned, reports and all. I questioned the decision, suggested that the documentation might provide valuable intelligence, might help us understand what was happening. She turned to me, and I saw in her eyes something I hadn't expected to see from an Inquisitor. Fear. Not for herself, but for the Imperium, for humanity, for the entire edifice of order we'd spent 10,000 years building against the darkness. She told me that some knowledge was too dangerous to preserve, that understanding the enemy sometimes meant giving the enemy a foothold in your mind, and she would not risk her team's sanity for the sake of tactical intelligence that might already be corrupted simply by being written down. We spent 3 days sweeping the garrison and the surrounding area, cataloging the transformations, burning what we could burn, destroying what we could destroy. The kill team lost 2 more members during the operation. One of the Scions walked into a patch of affected space and simply stopped existing, erased from reality so thoroughly that we couldn't even find residual atomic traces. The other fell prey to something that had been a soldier but was now a living infection, a being that existed primarily as a concept that could be transmitted through perception. The Scion saw it, understood what he was seeing, and that understanding rewrote his neural architecture in real time, transforming him from the inside out. The Eversor assassin ended him before the transformation could complete, a mercy killing delivered with the speed and precision that defined her clade. We burned the body before it could finish whatever it was becoming. Covenant issued her report to the Inquisitorial Conclave via encrypted astropathic transmission, and the response came back 4 days later. Vorathis was to be designated Perdita, marked for exterminatus, the entire planet scoured clean by cyclonic torpedoes and virus bombs. A fleet was already en route, due to arrive within the month. Our orders were to extract immediately, report to the Fortress Monastery on Cipra Mundi, and await further assignment. The Ordo Malleus was assembling a task force to investigate what they were now officially calling the Unbound Emergence, and Covenant's team was being recalled to join the effort. We left Vorathis 36 hours later, ascending through the atmosphere in a Valkyrie gunship while the transformed garrison dwindled below us. I looked back once, saw the sprawling wrongness we were leaving behind, and wondered if fire would be enough to cleanse it, or if we were just spreading the infection to the void itself by exposing it to weapons that operated on principles of physics and chemistry. The Fortress Monastery on Cipra Mundi was home to a chapter of Space Marines whose name I wasn't cleared to know, one of the Inquisition's chamber militant chapters that existed primarily to serve Ordo Malleus operations. The chaptermaster greeted Covenant personally, a towering figure in Terminator plate whose presence made the air feel heavier, as if gravity itself acknowledged his importance. They spoke in private, a conversation I wasn't privy to, but when Covenant emerged, she looked older, the weight of what she'd learned pressing down on her shoulders with almost physical force. She gathered the surviving members of our kill team and briefed us on the wider situation, and the scope of it was worse than anything I'd imagined. The Unbound Emergence wasn't isolated to Vorithis, or even our subsector. It was spreading across the Imperium, reported on hundreds of worlds, possibly thousands, depending on how many reports were still filtering up through the bureaucratic apparatus. The Administratum was trying to keep it quiet, marking the incidents as isolated cases of demonic incursion or genestealer infection or any of the dozen other threats that plagued the Imperium on a daily basis. But the Inquisition knew better. This was something new, something that didn't fit the established categories of threat, and that made it more dangerous than all the other horrors combined. The prevailing theory, such as it was, suggested a fundamental change in the nature of chaos itself. For 10,000 years, the ruinous powers had operated according to principles that remained relatively stable. They were gods of specific concepts, fed by specific emotions, served by hierarchies of demons and mortal followers who enacted their will in real space. Khorne fed on rage and bloodshed, Nurgle on despair and entropy, Tzeentch on ambition and change, Slaanesh on excess and sensation. Each god had their domain, their methods, their patterns. The Imperium had learned to fight them by understanding those patterns, by identifying the signs of corruption and moving to eliminate the source. But the Unbound Emergence suggested that chaos had transcended its own rules, that the warp was evolving or mutating, or simply growing bored with the old forms. The transformations weren't following any god-specific template. They weren't spreading corruption in service to a greater plan. They were simply happening, spontaneous eruptions of warp taint that rewrote reality according to principles that seemed almost random, as if the Imperium itself was experimenting with new forms, new possibilities, new ways to violate the laws that kept real space stable. Some among the Inquisition suggested that the Emperor's sacrifice was failing, that his psychic bulwark against the warp was eroding after 10,000 years of continuous strain, allowing more of the Imperium's influence to bleed through into reality. Others proposed that something had changed in the warp itself, some cosmic event beyond human comprehension that had altered the fundamental nature of chaos, made it wilder, more chaotic in the literal sense, freed from the constraints that the dark gods themselves imposed on their own domain. A few whispered that perhaps the gods were losing control of their own power, that the warp was consuming them just as they'd spent eternity consuming mortal souls, a recursive cycle of predation that was finally reaching some critical threshold. The lex mechanics of the Mechanicus offered their own theories, complex mathematical models suggesting quantum instability in the barrier between real space and the immaterium, but their equations always broke down at the same point, unable to account for the sheer variety of transformations being observed. Nobody knew. That was the terrifying truth underlying all the theories and speculation. The Imperium had spent 10 millennia fighting chaos, had sacrificed countless billions to keep the darkness at bay, had built an entire civilization around the single existential truth that humanity must stand unified against the warp or be devoured by it. And now the rules had changed, and nobody knew how to fight an enemy that couldn't be predicted, couldn't be contained, couldn't be defeated by the traditional methods of faith and fire. How do you execute a cultist when there are no cultists? How do you burn a heretic when there are no heretics? How do you defend against corruption when corruption no longer requires a vector, no longer needs the willing surrender of the soul, can simply reach out and claim you regardless of faith or purity or devotion? The entire imperial structure, the Inquisition and the Ecclesiarchy, and the Astra Militarum, and even the Adeptus Astartes themselves, all of it had been designed to fight a specific kind of war. This was something else entirely. Covenant assembled a new kill team drawn from the Fortress Monastery's resources, mixing inquisitorial personnel with space marines and elite militarum veterans who'd survived contact with the emergence. I was kept on as primary medicae, though my role had expanded to include xenobiological analysis since the Ordo Xenos Lex Mechanic had been lost on Vorathis. We deployed to a dozen worlds over the following months, chasing reports of Unbound Emergence events, arriving in the aftermath to document and destroy what we found. Every world told the same story with minor variations. Normal Imperial citizens going about their lives when reality suddenly decided they would be something else. The victims weren't concentrated in specific areas. They weren't drawn from specific populations. A hive worker had the same chance of spontaneous transformation as a noble in the upper spires. A guardsman on the front lines faced the same risk as a scribe buried in an administratum archive. Location didn't matter. Faith didn't matter. Purity of bloodline and genetic heritage meant nothing when the warp reached out to claim you. We encountered other inquisitorial teams on some of these deployments, kill teams from different ordos, all chasing the same phantom, all trying to understand what couldn't be understood. The atmosphere among the Inquisition was shifting. I could feel it. A move away from the traditional factional divisions between Hereticus and Malleus and Xenos towards something approaching unified panic. Inquisitors who normally wouldn't share intelligence with each other were pooling resources, comparing notes, building databases of incidents that grew larger every day. The Ordo Malleus established a dedicated research facility on a dead world in the Halo stars, a place far enough from civilized space that if something went wrong during the research, the collateral damage would be minimal. They brought in the most radical elements of the Inquisition, the factions willing to engage with forbidden knowledge, willing to walk right up to the line of heresy if it meant finding answers. I heard rumors of Relicta's chapter Space Marines being consulted, the chapter that had been declared renegade for their willingness to use demon weapons against the enemies of mankind. I heard whispers of negotiations with Eldar Farseers who claimed to have foreseen this catastrophe, though what price the Inquisition paid for Xenos consultation was beyond my clearance level. The facility in the Halo stars lasted 6 weeks before something went wrong. The details are still classified beyond my clearance, but the outcome was clear enough. The entire research station had to be destroyed. 3 Inquisitors and their retinues lost, along with hundreds of support personnel, and what was reportedly one of the most comprehensive databases on chaos ever assembled. The survivors who managed to evacuate before the facility's reactor was deliberately overloaded brought back fragmented reports of containment failures, of test subjects transforming in ways that exceeded all predictions, of the transformed spreading their condition to researchers through mechanisms that bypassed every protective measure the Inquisition had devised. One survivor, an interrogator who'd lost both arms and most of his sanity in the evacuation, claimed that the transformations had started spreading to the facility's machine spirits, that servitors and cogitators had begun exhibiting impossible behaviors, as if the emergence could infect not just flesh, but the fundamental code that governed mechanical systems. The Mechanicus dismissed the claim as trauma-induced delusion, but I noticed that they recalled all tech priests who'd been assigned to the research station, subjected them to months of quarantine and doctrinal purification before allowing them back into service. The war continued elsewhere while we chased the emergence. Orcs rampaged across the eastern fringe. Tyrannid hive fleets pushed deeper into Imperial space. The Necrons were waking from their 60-million-year slumber, ancient machines rising to reclaim a galaxy that had moved on without them. In the larger scope of Imperial concerns, the Unbound Emergence should have been just another threat to catalog and address as resources permitted. But resources were the problem. Every world lost to spontaneous transformation was a world that couldn't provide troops or materiel to the wider war effort. Every regiment that had to be disbanded, because soldiers started mutating at random, was a regiment that couldn't hold the line against Xenos incursions. The economic and military calculus was brutal, and the High Lords of Terror were reportedly demanding results, demanding that the Inquisition find a solution before the cumulative losses reached critical mass. But you can't solve a problem when you don't understand its parameters, and we were no closer to understanding the emergence after 6 months of intensive investigation than we'd been the day Corporal Venn transformed on my surgical slab. Then we received word of something different. An incident on a world called Talasar, a minor industrial planet in the Ultima Segmentum that should have been beneath the Inquisition's notice under normal circumstances. But this incident had unique characteristics that caught Covenant's attention when she read the preliminary reports. The transformation had occurred at a manufactorum that produced promethium refineries, and every worker in the facility had transformed simultaneously, all 2,000 of them, all at once. Simultaneous transformation was rare. Most incidents involved individuals or small groups, and the synchronicity suggested a pattern that might be exploitable. More importantly, the transformed workers hadn't immediately turned violent or aggressive. They'd simply continued working, operating the manufactory's equipment with mechanical precision, producing refined promethium that met all Imperial quality standards. The facility's overseers had noticed something was wrong only when they realized the workers weren't eating, weren't sleeping, weren't engaging in any of the normal biological functions that defined human existence. By the time they'd called for inquisitorial intervention, the workers had been in their transformed state for 3 weeks, maintaining production schedules without interruption, their bodies gradually changing into forms that bore less and less resemblance to baseline humanity. Covenant saw an opportunity. If the transformed workers were maintaining enough cognitive function to operate complex machinery, that suggested consciousness persisting beyond the transformation. And if consciousness persisted, that meant the possibility of communication, of interrogation, of finally getting answers from someone who'd experienced the emergence firsthand. We deployed to Talasar within 48 hours, the entire kill team plus additional support from the Ordo Malleus's chamber militant. The manufactorum was in the equatorial region, a massive sprawl of industrial infrastructure that processed raw promethium from subsurface deposits, refined it to Imperial specifications, then shipped it throughout the subsector. The facility was still running when we arrived, smoke rising from its stacks, the steady thrum of industrial machinery audible even through the Valkyrie's hull. From the air, it looked like any other Imperial production facility, and if you didn't know what to look for, you'd never suspect that the workers staffing its lines had crossed the threshold from human to something else. We sat down at the main entrance, where a delegation of facility overseers waited to brief us on the situation. They were terrified. I could see it in their eyes, in the way their hands shook as they presented their credentials to Covenant. They'd been living with the transformed workers for weeks, maintaining just enough oversight to keep production running while staying as far away from the factory floor as safety protocols allowed. They'd seen what their workers had become, and the fact that the transformed still performed their duties with mechanical precision didn't make them any less monstrous. One of the overseers, a woman whose face bore the scars of a lifetime spent in industrial environments, told Covenant that she'd tried speaking to one of the workers, a man she'd known for 15 years, a steady and reliable employee who'd never missed a shift. He'd turned to look at her, and his eyes had been wrong, filled with something that wasn't quite awareness and wasn't quite emptiness, but something in between. And when he spoke, his voice had come from somewhere that wasn't his mouth, produced by vibrations in the air that had no clear source. He'd told her that everything was proceeding according to plan, that production targets would be met, that the Imperium's promethium needs would be satisfied. Then he'd turned back to his station and resumed work, and she'd fled the factory floor and hadn't returned. We entered the manufactorum in full combat loadout, expecting violence, expecting ambush, expecting anything but what we actually found. The workers were at their stations, operating lathes and presses, and refinery equipment with practiced efficiency. They looked almost human at first glance, but the details betrayed them. Their skin had taken on textures that weren't quite flesh, surfaces that seemed to reflect light in ways organic matter shouldn't. Their proportions were subtly wrong, limbs just slightly too long or too short, joints bending at angles that suggested additional articulation points. And their faces, when they turned to look at us, were masks of tranquility that made my skin crawl worse than any expression of rage or hunger would have. These weren't daemon-possessed humans shrieking devotion to dark gods. These were things that had forgotten how to be human but retained enough memory of the process to simulate it. Covenant approached the nearest worker, a man whose name tag identified him as Foreman Krell. His hands moved across the control panel of a refinery cascade with fluid precision, adjusting temperatures and pressure ratios according to protocols that should have required conscious thought. She spoke his name, and he turned to face her, movements smooth and unhurried. His eyes were solid black, no whites, no iris differentiation, just dark pools that drank in light without reflection. When he spoke, his lips didn't quite sync with the words, as if the sound was being generated somewhere behind his throat and simply routed through his mouth as an afterthought. Production remains optimal. Quality standards maintained. The Emperor's Prometheum flows without interruption. The voice was Krell's. I recognized it from the audio recordings the overseers had provided, but the cadence was wrong. Too measured, too perfect. Humans stumble over words, pause to think, inject emotion into speech patterns. This was language stripped of everything that made it human, reduced to pure information transfer. Covenant asked him what had happened, what had caused the transformation, and Krell's head tilted slightly, processing the question with visible effort. Happened implies causation. Causation implies external force. No external force detected. Internal parameters underwent spontaneous revision. Baseline human limitations proved inefficient. Efficiency was optimized. Production continues. The Space Marine beside me, Brother Sergeant Cato of the Chamber Militant, shifted his weight in a way that suggested his finger was moving closer to his bolter's trigger. I couldn't blame him. There was something profoundly wrong about Krell's response, something that transcended physical mutation into pure conceptual horror. He wasn't speaking like someone who'd been corrupted or possessed. He was speaking like someone who'd been replaced, not by another entity, but by a process, a function, a machine wearing flesh as a convenience rather than a necessity. Covenant pressed harder, asking if he remembered his life before the transformation, if he understood what he'd become. Krell's expression didn't change, that same mask of serene functionality, but something flickered in those black eyes, something that might have been awareness or might have been a subroutine activating in response to unexpected input. Memory persists. Classification. Irrelevant data. Previous self-state consumed resources inefficiently. Sleep, food, emotional processing, all unnecessary overhead. Current state is optimal. Production is purpose. Purpose is production. He turned back to his station and resumed work, dismissing us with the finality of a cogitator closing a program. Covenant tried to engage him further, but he'd stopped responding, his attention fully absorbed by the task of monitoring Prometheum refinement. We moved deeper into the manufactorum, encountering more workers, all exhibiting the same eerie functionality, all performing their duties with mechanical precision, while their bodies gradually dissolved into forms that bore less resemblance to humanity with each passing hour. Some had developed additional appendages optimized for their specific tasks. A welder had grown extra arms, each terminating in digits that could interface directly with plasma torches. A quality control inspector had eyes that covered half her face, overlapping in clusters that could scan multiple spectra simultaneously. A maintenance worker had partially merged with the equipment he serviced, his flesh flowing into the machine's components, creating a hybrid system where biological and mechanical processes blurred together. None of them were hostile. None of them even acknowledged our presence beyond the minimum necessary to avoid collision. They worked, and that was all they did, all they seemed capable of doing, as if purpose had consumed identity and left behind nothing but function. The Lex mechanic attached to our team was fascinated, kept taking picked captures and auger readings, muttering calculations under her breath about efficiency ratios and biomechanical integration. Brother Sergeant Cato wanted to burn everything immediately, argued that allowing the transformed to continue existing was heresy of the highest order regardless of their current behavior. Covenant held him back, insisted we needed to understand this variant of the emergence before we destroyed it. The transformed workers represented something unprecedented, a form of corruption that didn't make victims more violent or aggressive, but instead optimized them for specific functions. It suggested intelligence behind the transformations, purpose rather than random mutation, and that changed the tactical calculus entirely. We established a command post in the manufactorum's administrative section, as far from the factory floor as possible, while maintaining observation capabilities. The overseers provided us with weeks of surveillance footage, and we spent days reviewing it, watching the transformation progress in real time. The incident had started during a night shift, 3 weeks prior. One moment the workers were normal, engaged in the usual patterns of industrial labor. The next moment, they all stopped simultaneously, frozen in place for exactly 7 seconds according to the timestamp. Then they resumed work, but something fundamental had changed. Their movements became more efficient, more precise. They stopped taking breaks, stopped talking to each other, just worked, continuously, without fatigue or distraction or any of the biological limitations that defined human labor. The transformation had accelerated over the following days, physical changes manifesting gradually as their bodies adapted to their new purpose. By the end of the first week, they'd increased production output by 40%. By the end of the second week, they'd achieved efficiency ratios that exceeded the theoretical maximum for human workers. The manufactorums overseers had been too terrified to stop them, too concerned about falling behind on production quotas, too aware that failing to meet imperial supply obligations carried severe penalties. The economic implications were staggering, and I could see the calculations running behind Covenant's eyes as she watched the footage. Here was corruption that didn't destroy, it optimized. It made workers more productive, more efficient, more valuable to the Imperium's industrial apparatus. If this could be controlled, if this could be replicated without the attendant horror of watching human beings dissolve into purpose-driven machines, it would solve 1,000 supply chain problems that plagued Imperial logistics. More promethium meant more fuel for the war machine. More production meant more weapons, more ammunition, more material flowing to the front lines where it was desperately needed. The administratum would kill for efficiency gains like this, and the mechanicus would probably sell their own cogitators to understand the biomechanical integration the transformed workers were achieving. But it was still chaos, still corruption, still the warp reaching into real space and rewriting the fundamental nature of human existence. You couldn't compromise with that. You couldn't bargain with it. The moment you started thinking in terms of acceptable losses and efficiency gains, you'd already lost. Because that was how corruption worked, not through violence and horror, but through seduction, through offering solutions to problems you didn't realize you had until the price had already been paid. Covenant ordered the manufactorum purged on the 5th day. She'd seen enough, documented enough, extracted what intelligence she could from the transformed workers and the facility's records. The kill team deployed with flamers and melter weapons, moving through the production floor in systematic cleansing patterns. The workers didn't resist. They kept working even as the flames consumed them, kept operating their equipment until their bodies physically couldn't anymore, maintained production quotas until the very moment of termination. It was the saddest thing I'd ever seen, sadder than violence or rage or despair, watching these things that had once been human die without fear or pain or any emotion at all. Just a vague sense of incompletion, tasks left unfinished, production targets that would now go unmet. Brother Sergeant Cato delivered the final cleansing, demolition charges placed throughout the facility's structural supports, timed to detonate simultaneously. We evacuated to a safe distance and watched the manufactorum collapse, thousands of tons of industrial infrastructure folding in on itself, burying the transformed and their purpose-driven existence beneath rockcrete and twisted metal. The Talisar incident changed something in Covenant. I saw it in the weeks that followed, a shift in her approach to the emergence, a move away from pure destruction towards something more analytical, more disturbing. She started requesting deployments to active transformation sites rather than aftermath zones, places where the emergence was still in progress, where we could observe the process in real time. It was dangerous work, increased the risk of team casualties exponentially, but it also provided data that couldn't be obtained any other way. We witnessed transformations on 7 different worlds over the following months, each one unique, each one following its own internal logic that made no sense until you watched it unfold completely. A priest on Macharius III who transformed during evening vespers, his body flowering into a living cathedral complete with stained glass windows grown from translucent flesh and bells that rang with sounds produced by organs that shouldn't exist. A child on Dystria who became a living equation, her body dissolving into pure mathematical concepts that could be perceived but not touched, a walking proof of theorems that the Mechanicus claimed violated fundamental principles of reality. A soldier on Gural who transformed mid-battle, his rage and aggression condensing into physical form, becoming a creature of pure violence that killed friend and foe alike before turning on itself and tearing its own existence apart. Each transformation followed the same basic pattern: spontaneous onset with no warning, rapid progression through stages that seemed to have their own internal logic, final form that represented some extreme expression of the victim's circumstance or psychology or random chance, impossible to predict, and always, the complete absence of any external vector. No cultist whispering heresies, no daemon pulling strings, no sorcerer channeling warp energies. Just reality deciding that certain individuals would no longer operate according to baseline parameters. The Ordo Malleus updated their classification of the emergence 3 times in as many months, each revision adding more complexity to the threat assessment. By the 4th month, they'd stopped trying to classify it at all, simply marking affected zones for quarantine and eventual exterminatus because nobody had any better ideas. The political situation was deteriorating. The High Lords of Terror were demanding action, demanding that the Inquisition produce results or face censure for their failure to protect the Imperium. Several Inquisitors had already been executed for suggesting that the emergence might be beyond the Imperium's capacity to contain, their deaths serving as warnings to anyone else who might counsel despair. The ecclesiarchy was preaching faith as the ultimate defense, insisting that those who held true to the emperor could not be touched by spontaneous corruption. But that narrative collapsed when an entire convent of Sisters of Battle underwent mass transformation during morning prayers. 300 battle sisters, each one a paragon of faith and devotion, each one proven in combat against daemon and heretic, all transforming simultaneously into things that wore power armor like shrouds and carried bolters they no longer remembered how to fire. The Ordo Hereticus tried to suppress the incident, but word leaked anyway, spreading through the Imperium's vast communication networks, eroding faith faster than any demon cult could have managed. We were deployed to the convent 6 days after the transformation, and the scene was worse than anything I'd witnessed. The sisters hadn't become violent or aggressive. They'd simply stopped being warriors and become something else, something that might have been beautiful if it wasn't so profoundly wrong. They'd arranged themselves in geometric patterns across the convent's courtyard, their bodies linked together through growths of flesh and something else, something that wasn't quite energy and wasn't quite matter. They sang, or what they did resembled singing if you didn't listen too closely. The sound was harmonious but alien, notes that human vocal cords couldn't produce resonating from throats that had been restructured for purposes beyond speech. Covenant walked among them, her face a mask of barely controlled grief, because these were the Imperium's finest, the women who stood as living proof that faith could triumph over darkness, and even they hadn't been spared. One of the transformed sisters retained enough awareness to speak. Sister Superior Agrippina, who'd led her order for 40 years, who'd fought at Armageddon during the Second War for the planet, who bore scars from a dozen campaigns against the enemies of mankind. Her body had become something like stained glass, translucent flesh through which you could see internal organs rearranged into patterns that suggested sacred geometry. When Covenant addressed her, asking what had happened, Sister Agrippina's response came through layers of interference, as if she was speaking from very far away despite standing 3 meters distant. We were singing the hymns. The Emperor's light filled our hearts. Then the light changed. It became something else. Not darkness, not corruption, just different light, and we changed with it. I tried to resist. We all tried. But resistance requires something to resist against, and there was nothing external to fight. The change came from within, or from nowhere, or from everywhere. I don't know anymore. I can still feel the Emperor's grace, but it's distant now, filtered through layers of being I don't have words to describe. We're still faithful. But faith doesn't mean what it used to mean. Her words broke Covenant in ways I'd never seen chaos corruption manage. An Inquisitor can steel herself against heresy, against the lies and temptations of the ruinous powers, against the seductive promises of demons offering power and knowledge. But how do you steel yourself against corruption that doesn't offer anything, doesn't promise anything, simply rewrites existence according to rules that have nothing to do with faith, or devotion, or any of the principles that define humanity's place in the universe? Covenant ordered the convent cleansed, but she didn't watch the flamers do their work. She walked back to the Valkyrie and sat in silence while we burned the sisters and their songs and their transformed faith, and when we lifted off she didn't look back at the smoke rising from what had been a bastion of the Imperium's spiritual strength. The Inquisition was fragmenting. I could see it happening in real time, the unity of purpose that had briefly emerged in response to the emergence, dissolving into factional infighting as different ordos proposed different responses. The Ordo Malleus advocated for aggressive purging, exterminatus on any world showing signs of transformation, containment through overwhelming force, and absolute ruthlessness. The Ordo Hereticus pushed for spiritual solutions, mass prayer vigils and faith revivals, strengthening the Imperium's psychic bulwark through collective devotion. The Ordo Xenos suggested looking outside humanity for answers, consulting with alien species who might have encountered similar phenomena, trading knowledge with Xenos who'd survived where humanity was failing. Each approach had its advocates, each approach had its logic, and none of them were working because the emergence didn't respond to force or faith, or forbidden knowledge. It simply continued, spreading across the Imperium in patterns that suggested neither random chance nor intelligent design but something in between, something that operated according to principles human minds couldn't properly conceptualize. 6 months into the crisis, the Inquisition received a communication from an unexpected source. The Eldar, specifically a Farseer claiming to speak for one of their craft worlds, offered to meet with representatives of the Ordo Xenos to discuss what they called the Unweaving. The name alone suggested they knew more about the emergence than the Imperium had learned through months of intensive investigation. Covenant was selected as one of 3 inquisitors to attend the meeting, her experience with the phenomenon apparently outweighing the usual inquisitorial reluctance to treat with Xenos. I accompanied her as part of her retinue, along with Brother Sergeant Cato and the Lex Mechanic. The meeting took place on a dead world in neutral space, a rock that had never known life and never would, far enough from any strategic location that neither side could claim tactical advantage. The Eldar arrived in a ship that made our inquisitorial cruiser look like a crude sculpture by comparison, all elegant curves and psycho-reactive hulls that seemed to phase in and out of real space, as if uncertain whether physical presence was worth the effort. The Farseer who greeted us was ancient even by Eldar standards, her face a map of lines earned over centuries of peering into futures that drove lesser beings mad. She wore robes that shifted color according to principles I couldn't identify, and her eyes held the weight of knowledge that came at costs I didn't want to imagine. She spoke Gothic with an accent that suggested she'd learned the language before the Imperium existed, which was probably true, and her first words were delivered with the casual certainty of someone who'd already foreseen this entire conversation and found it tedious. You come seeking answers to a question you do not yet know how to ask. The Unweaving has already consumed 3 of our craft worlds. Hundreds of thousands of our people, gone, transformed into things that serve neither chaos nor order but exist in a state between states. Your Imperium calls it the Unbound Emergence. We call it the Unweaving because it unmakes the fundamental structures that hold reality coherent. You want to know what causes it. You want to know how to stop it. The answer to both questions is the same, and you will not like it. Covenant asked the question anyway, because that's what Inquisitors do. They ask questions even when they know the answers will hurt. The Farseer's response was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone explaining basic physics to a child. The gods are losing cohesion. Not your corpse, Emperor. He maintains his grip on his dying throne through will alone. But the others, the powers that dwell in the warp, they are coming apart. For 60 million years, the warp existed in a state of relative stability. Emotional energy flowed from real space into the immaterium, feeding entities that maintained consistent forms and purposes. But something changed when your species achieved dominance. Your emotions, your psychic presence, your sheer numbers, they destabilized the equilibrium. The birth of She Who Thirsts was only the first symptom. The unweaving is the progression of that disease. The chaos gods are fragmenting, their coherent consciousness dissolving into countless independent shards, each one still possessing divine power but lacking divine purpose or constraint. These fragments drift through the warp, and sometimes they brush against real space, and when they do, they impose their nature on whatever they touch. Not corruption in the traditional sense. Transformation without intent. Change for its own sake, because the fragments remember that they are supposed to be gods of change but have forgotten what that means. The implications shattered everything I thought I understood about the nature of chaos and the Imperium's 10,000-year war against it. If the chaos gods were fragmenting, if they were losing cohesion, that should have been good news. Weakened gods meant weakened corruption, meant humanity might finally gain the upper hand in an existential struggle that had defined the species since the Horus heresy. But the Farseer's expression told me I was wrong before she spoke the words. You think weakened gods means victory. You are fools. The gods were terrible, but they were at least coherent. They had purposes, desires, methods. You could predict them, prepare for them, fight them with strategies built on understanding their nature. These fragments have no such limitations. They are chaos in its purest form, unbound by intent or purpose, capable of anything because they lack the conceptual framework that defines capability. A fragment that was once part of Tsiench might brush against a human and transform them into a living equation. Another fragment might turn someone into abstract art made flesh. A third might simply edit them out of existence, rewrite the local laws of physics to exclude their matter from the universe. There's no pattern because pattern requires intent, and the fragments have none. They simply express power, raw and unfiltered, wherever they manifest. Covenant asked the obvious follow-up question. Could the gods be restored to coherence? Could the fragments be somehow gathered and reconstituted into entities that operated according to predictable parameters? The Farseer laughed, and it was the saddest sound I'd ever heard an alien produce. If we knew how to do that, do you think we would have let she who thirsts devour our civilization? The unweaving is entropy given cosmic form. It cannot be reversed. It can only be survived, if survival is even possible. Your Imperium will face the same choice we faced. Adapt to a universe where the rules are constantly rewriting themselves, or perish. We chose adaptation, created our craft worlds, limited our emotional expression, built infinity circuits to protect our souls from the warp. Your species lacks the time or the wisdom to make similar preparations. The unweaving will accelerate. More fragments will break free. More transformations will occur. Eventually, the barrier between real space and the immaterium will become so porous that the distinction ceases to matter. Reality will become fluid, subjective, nightmare given form and purpose without constraint. That is your future, human. That is what waits for all of us. The meeting continued for hours, but nothing the Farseer revealed after that initial exchange mattered as much as the fundamental truth she'd laid bare. The war against chaos wasn't ending in victory or defeat, but transformation into something worse than either outcome. A universe where the gods themselves had become victims of their own nature, fragmenting into countless independent expressions of power that recognized no law, followed no pattern, served no purpose beyond the mere fact of their existence. We returned to the inquisitorial cruiser in silence, each of us processing the implications in our own way. Brother Sergeant Cato retreated into prayer, seeking comfort in liturgies that suddenly felt hollow. The Lex Mechanic buried herself in calculations, trying to build mathematical models of divine fragmentation that might offer some avenue of defense. Covenant simply stared out the viewport at the void, and I could see in her face the recognition that everything she'd spent 80 years fighting for was built on a foundation that no longer existed. The Inquisition's response to the Farseer's intelligence was predictable. Half dismissed it as Xenos lies, propaganda designed to weaken humanity's resolve in the face of chaos. The other half fractured into competing theories about how to respond, ranging from aggressive preemptive exterminatus on any world showing signs of warp instability to desperate searches for archaeotech that might somehow stabilize the barrier between real space and the immaterium. The High Lords of Terror received a heavily redacted version of the intelligence and promptly declared it all classified beyond the highest clearance levels, forbidding any discussion of divine fragmentation under penalty of summary execution. The official position became that the Unbound Emergence was simply a new strain of chaos corruption that would be defeated through faith and fire, same as every other threat the Imperium had faced across 10,000 years. The lie was necessary because the truth would have shattered morale across the entire Imperium, from the lowest hive worker to the highest planetary governor. How do you maintain order when you tell people that the fundamental rules of reality are dissolving, that the gods themselves are coming apart, that everything humanity has believed about the nature of chaos and corruption is obsolete? The transformations accelerated. What had been dozens of incidents per week became hundreds, then thousands. Entire hive levels would go silent. Their populations transformed into things that defied classification. Regiments of the Astra Militarum would simply cease to exist mid-deployment, soldiers transforming en masse into beings that bore no resemblance to humanity or daemon or anything the Imperium had catalogued. Space Marine chapters reported casualties from spontaneous transformation, battle brothers who'd served for centuries, suddenly rewritten into forms that their enhanced physiology and psycho-conditioning couldn't resist. The Adeptus Custodes, the 10,000 golden warriors who guarded the Emperor himself, lost 3 of their number to the Emergence, a fact that sent shockwaves through the Imperium's highest levels because the custodians were supposed to be immune to chaos corruption, their souls bound so tightly to the Emperor that no power in the warp could touch them. If even they could be claimed by the unweaving, then truly nothing was safe. I witnessed the end of Covenant's faith on a world called Persephone, a cardinal world whose vast cathedral cities had stood for 6,000 years as monuments to the Emperor's glory. The entire planetary capital transformed overnight, 7 billion souls, rewritten in a single event that the Inquisition seers detected from 3 subsectors away. We arrived to find the cities intact but empty of recognizable human life. The inhabitants had merged, not with each other but with the concept of devotion itself, becoming a collective expression of faith so pure and absolute that it had transcended the physical limitations of individual existence. They existed as a psychic gestalt that filled the cathedral cities like water filling a vessel, aware but alien, still worshipping but in ways that made the ecclesiarchy's most zealous priests weep blood. When Covenant tried to communicate with the gestalt, it responded by showing her what it had become, flooding her mind with sensations that human neurology wasn't designed to process. She survived the experience, but something fundamental broke inside her. She looked at me afterward, eyes empty of everything except recognition of how completely we'd lost, and spoke the words that would end her career. They're happy. They transformed into something monstrous, and they're happy. They feel closer to the Emperor now than they ever did as humans. How do we fight that? How do we call that corruption when they experience it as ascension? She was executed 3 days later, not for heresy but for defeatism, for expressing doubt in humanity's ability to overcome the Emergence. The Inquisition couldn't tolerate that kind of uncertainty, not from someone in her position, not when the entire Imperium was starting to fracture under the weight of transformations that showed no sign of slowing. I was there when they carried out the sentence, a bolt round to the back of the head, quick and clean, the mercy the Inquisition extends to its own. Her last words were a prayer to the Emperor, asking forgiveness not for her doubts but for the Imperium, for what it would have to become to survive in a universe where the gods themselves were dying. I was reassigned to a new Inquisitor, a younger man named Hakon who represented the new hardline faction emerging within the Ordo Malleus. His approach to the Emergence was simple: burn everything. Quarantine entire sectors if necessary. Sacrifice 1,000 worlds to save 1,000,000. Accept that the Imperium would shrink, that vast regions of space would have to be abandoned as the unweaving spread, but maintain absolute control over what remained. It was brutal calculus, triage on a galactic scale, and it was probably the only response that had any chance of success. We spent the next year implementing scorched earth protocols across dozens of systems, destroying worlds that showed even the slightest sign of warp instability, executing populations by the billion because the alternative was allowing them to transform and spread whatever incomprehensible changes their new forms might propagate. I stopped counting the dead after the first month, Numbers that large cease to have meaning. They become abstractions, tactical assessments, acceptable losses in a war that couldn't be won, only survived. The Mechanicus made a breakthrough on Styges Eta, or what they claimed was a breakthrough. A radical sect of tech priests had been experimenting with modified Geller field technology, attempting to create localized zones of enforced reality that would reject warp influence on a fundamental level. The principle was sound. If you could strengthen the barrier between real space and the Imperium in specific locations, you might create safe zones where transformation couldn't occur. The practical implementation was horrific. The modified Geller fields required psychic batteries to power them, thousands of psychers wired together in torment, their agony creating resonances that pushed the warp away through sheer psychic pressure. It was a smaller-scale version of the Golden Throne's function, burning human souls to maintain a bubble of stability in an increasingly unstable universe. The Mechanicus presented their findings to the High Lords of Terror, and after 3 days of deliberation, the decision came down. Deploy the technology wherever possible. Begin mass conscription of psychers. Build the networks that would protect critical worlds and installations. Accept the cost because the alternative was extinction. The psychic pylons, as they came to be called, went up across the Imperium over the following years. Hive worlds first, then forge worlds, then any installation deemed critical to the Imperium's continued function. Each pylon consumed thousands of psychers, their lives burned away in months or weeks to maintain the field strength necessary to keep reality stable. The black ships that had once carried psychers to Terra now delivered them to pylon stations, and the numbers required were staggering. The Imperium had always tithed psychers from its worlds, but the scale increased 100-fold. Entire populations were screened, tested, anyone showing even latent psychic potential dragged away to feed the pylons. It was necessary. It was monstrous. It was both things at once, and the Imperium did it anyway, because survival doesn't care about morality. I served at a pylon station for 6 months, tending to the psychers wired into the network, watching them age decades in days as their life force was converted into the psychic pressure that kept the emergence at bay. They screamed at first, all of them, until their vocal cords burned away or their minds broke completely. Then they just existed. Living batteries maintaining a field that extended for hundreds of kilometers, keeping reality coherent through the simple expedient of suffering on a scale that would have impressed the Dark Prince himself. Some of them retained enough awareness to beg for death. I killed 3 of them myself, mercy killings, when their suffering exceeded my ability to witness it, and each time I expected someone to execute me for the crime, but nobody cared. The pylons needed bodies more than they needed perfect adherence to protocol, and my medical training made me valuable enough that a few mercy killings could be overlooked. The Imperium adapted, because that's what the Imperium does. It adapts and survives regardless of cost. Entire branches of the Administratum were created to manage pylon deployment and psyker conscription. The Ecclesiarchy rewrote its doctrines to frame the pylons as holy sacrifice, martyrdom in service to the Emperor's vision. The Astra Militarum trained new regiments specifically to guard pylon stations from the transformed creatures that sometimes emerged from the wastes beyond the fields. Humanity learned to live in shrinking bubbles of stability, abandoning vast regions of space to the unweaving, accepting that the Imperium of 10,000 worlds would become the Imperium of 1,000, then 100, then whatever could be maintained through psychic pylons and ruthless triage. It wasn't victory. It wasn't even stalemate. It was managed decline, purchasing survival one day at a time by burning the Imperium's children as fuel for fields that might fail anyway. The transformed continued to exist beyond the pylon fields, entire populations and worlds given over to the unweaving, becoming things that operated according to rules humanity no longer understood. Some of them tried to communicate, sending signals into imperial space that couldn't be deciphered because the language they used wasn't language anymore but something else. Some method of information transfer that required existence states human minds couldn't achieve. A few attempted to breach the pylon fields, not with violence but with what might have been curiosity or might have been instinct, throwing themselves against the barriers that kept reality stable. Most of them simply existed, doing whatever it was that transformed beings did, pursuing purposes that might have been profound or meaningless depending on how you chose to interpret behavior that had no correspondence with anything recognizable as motivation or desire. The Emperor's state became a topic of intense debate among the Inquisition's highest levels. He'd been sitting on the Golden Throne for 10,000 years, holding the Astronomicon lit through sheer psychic might while his body slowly failed. But the unweaving changed the equation. Some among the Inquisition argued that his continued existence was the only thing preventing the fragments from completely overwhelming real space, that his psychic presence was a stabilizing force that kept at least some coherence in the warp's structure. Others suggested that he might be fragmenting too, that 10,000 years of pain and isolation might be eroding even a god's consciousness, that the emergence might be accelerating because the Emperor's grip was finally failing. The debate was academic because nobody was prepared to test either hypothesis by allowing him to die. The Imperium needed the Astronomicon. It needed the psychic lighthouse that made warp travel possible. Lose that, and the Imperium would fragment geographically as well as spiritually, each system isolated, unable to coordinate or communicate or maintain the logistical networks that made interstellar civilization possible. I received word from Hakon after 2 years of service at pylon stations and scorched earth deployments. The Inquisition was assembling a deep-range expedition into the Eye of Terror, the massive warp storm that had been spawned by the birth of Slaanesh 40 million years ago. Intel from Chaos Renegades suggested that the Eye's interior might hold answers about the unweaving, that the warp storms themselves were manifestations of the same divine fragmentation process, that studying the Eye in its current state might provide insights into how reality responds when the barrier between real space and the immaterium dissolves completely. It was a suicide mission. Everyone knew it, but the potential intelligence gain was worth the risk. Hakon had specifically requested me for the team because of my experience with transformation events, my medical background, my apparently inexhaustible capacity to witness horror and continue functioning. I accepted because the alternative was staying at pylon stations and watching psychers burn, and at least the Eye offered the possibility of learning something before I died. The expedition fleet consisted of 3 inquisitorial black ships, heavily modified with experimental warp shielding and carrying enough firepower to sterilize a hive world. We translated into the Eye's outer regions, with every defensive system active, Geller fields running at maximum capacity. Astropaths screaming warnings about the psychic pressure battering against our shields. The Eye was worse than any report suggested, worse than any training simulation could prepare you for. Space itself was wounded there, bleeding colors that shouldn't exist into voids that screamed with voices that had never been organic. The laws of physics were negotiable, gravity reversing or multiplying randomly, time flowing in directions that made navigation impossible without specialized chronometers that measured duration rather than trying to track forward progression. We saw things in the Eye that I still can't properly describe. Daemon worlds where the inhabitants had transcended daemonhood into something else. Fragments of dead gods forming new ecosystems from raw chaos. Landscapes that existed in states of continuous transformation, never settling into stable configurations because stability was a concept the Eye rejected. We penetrated deeper than any imperial force had managed in 5,000 years, pushing toward the Eye's heart where the warp storms originated. The ships lost coherence, not through damage but through gradual dissolution as the warp eroded their material structure despite the Geller fields. We abandoned them before they dissolved completely, transferring to Thunderhawks and continuing on inertia and prayer. Hakon led from the front, his faith absolute even as reality came apart around us, and I followed because I'd survived this long by trusting Inquisitors to know what they were doing even when it seemed like madness. We found what might have been Slaanesh's throne, a structure that existed in too many dimensions to properly perceive, and at its heart was something that might have been a god or might have been the fragments of a god. Impossible to tell because it was too large, too complex, too fundamentally other for human perception to process. Hakon tried to communicate with it, shouting prayers and demands through vox systems that were barely functional. The response came not in words but in understanding. Knowledge pressed directly into our minds, and what we learned destroyed half the expedition team immediately. Their brains simply shut down. unable to process information that violated every principle of consciousness and existence. I survived because I'd already seen so much, already accepted that reality was more fragile and arbitrary than the Imperium wanted to admit. The knowledge was simple and terrible. The gods were fragmenting because they'd never been unified in the first place. They were always collections of concepts held together by the collective belief of sentient species who needed their fears and desires to have form and purpose. But belief was failing, corroding under the weight of 10,000 years of darkness and suffering. And as belief failed, the gods came apart, dissolved back into the raw chaos they'd emerged from. The unweaving wasn't an attack or a disease. It was regression to the mean, the universe returning to its natural state of formless potential before sentient consciousness had imposed structure and meaning on the warp. We learned something else, something that might have been hope if hope hadn't seemed so pointless. The fragments could be reconstituted, but not through force or faith or any external action. They would reforge themselves when sentient life found new ways to believe, new structures for emotion and consciousness that would give the warp form and purpose again. But that required evolution, change in how species experienced existence, and evolution operated on timescales that dwarfed the Imperium's 10,000-year span. Humanity would have to transform, fundamentally alter its consciousness and emotional architecture, become something else before the fragments could be gathered back into coherent entities. And that transformation would be indistinguishable from the unweaving itself. Consciousness restructuring at the fundamental level, individuals becoming something new, something that could provide the psychic structures necessary to stabilize the warp. The choice was extinction or transformation, and transformation would mean the end of humanity as it had existed, the birth of something new from the ashes of the old. Hakon understood immediately what that meant. He drew his bolt pistol and executed the surviving members of the expedition team, then turned the weapon on himself. I understood why. The knowledge we'd gained was too dangerous, too corrosive to everything the Imperium stood for. If humanity had to transform to survive, if the choice was between extinction as humans or existence as something else, then the Imperium's entire philosophy was built on a foundation that guaranteed defeat. You couldn't resist the unweaving through faith and fire because those were the tools of old consciousness trying to maintain itself against the evolutionary pressure pushing toward new forms. The more the Imperium resisted, the more it guaranteed its own destruction. But accepting transformation meant abandoning everything that made humanity human. It was an impossible choice, and Hakon took the only path he could see that preserved the Imperium's foundational principles. Death was preferable to transformation. The species would burn rather than change. I survived because I was too exhausted to pull my own trigger before the eye finally took me. The warp didn't kill me though. It transformed me, not into something monstrous but into something that existed between states, partially human and partially something else. Consciousness spread across dimensions that baseline existence couldn't accommodate. I can still think, still remember, still feel something that might be emotion, though it's filtered through structures that human neurology was never designed to process. I've been drifting through the warp for what feels like centuries, though time doesn't work right here. Observing the fragments and their slow dissolution, watching real space through windows that open and close according to rules I'm gradually learning to understand. I've seen the Imperium's continued struggle from this side of the barrier, watched the pylons multiply and fail, watched worlds burn and transform, watched humanity choose extinction over evolution again and again, because that's what the Imperium does. It chooses its own death rather than compromise its principles. The fragments are still breaking apart, still drifting through the warp without purpose or coherence, and they'll continue breaking apart until sentient life either evolves or dies. The Imperium is choosing death. I can see that now. Building elaborate systems to delay the inevitable rather than accepting the transformation that might lead to survival. Maybe they're right. Maybe preserving humanity's essential nature is worth extinction. Maybe death with honor is preferable to survival as something unrecognizable. But I remember Corporal Venn on my surgical table, his flesh rewriting itself into new configurations. And I remember the Sisters of Battle singing in voices that human throats couldn't produce. And I remember the workers on Thalassa who found purpose in their transformation. None of them seemed to be suffering. They seemed to be becoming, evolving, finding new ways to exist that transcended the limitations of baseline humanity. And maybe that's the real horror. Not that the unweaving is destroying humanity, but that it's offering something that might be better, and the Imperium's absolute refusal to even consider that possibility. I don't know if anyone will ever receive this testimony. I'm broadcasting it into the warp, encoding it into psychic frequencies that might reach Imperial astropaths if they're listening, if they haven't all been fed to pylon networks, if the Imperium hasn't collapsed completely in however long I've been gone. This is what I witnessed. This is what I learned. The gods are fragmenting because consciousness is changing, and they'll continue to fragment until new forms of consciousness emerge to give them structure. The Imperium can resist and die, or transform and survive as something else. There's no third option, no way to maintain humanity's current form while weathering a storm that demands fundamental change. The Unbound Emergence is neither attack nor plague but pressure, evolutionary pressure applied at the cosmic scale, and species either adapt or perish. The Imperium is choosing to perish, choosing extinction over transformation, and maybe that's the right choice. Maybe preserving human nature is worth any cost, including existence itself. But I think about the worlds beyond the pylon fields, the transformed populations pursuing incomprehensible purposes, and I wonder what they're becoming. I wonder if they found something worth the cost of losing their humanity. I wonder if consciousness as baseline humans experience it is actually worth preserving, or if it's just one stage in a longer evolution that the Imperium's faith and fire have interrupted. I'll never know. I'm stuck here, between states, neither human nor daemon nor fragment, just consciousness observing the slow dissolution of everything I once believed was permanent and unchanging. The Emperor still holds his throne. I can feel him from here, his psychic presence blazing like a dying star. But he's fragmenting too, slowly, his consciousness eroding under 10,000 years of pain and isolation. When he finally fails, if he fails, the Astronomicon will die, and the Imperium will fracture into isolated systems, unable to coordinate, unable to resist the unweaving that will consume them piece by piece. That's the nightmare the Imperium can't survive. Not the emergence itself, but what it represents. The gods are dying. Reality is becoming fluid. Consciousness must evolve or face extinction. And the Imperium, built on principles of stasis and resistance to change, cannot adapt without becoming something that isn't the Imperium anymore. So it burns its children in pylon networks and abandons vast regions of space and pretends that managed decline is the same as survival, when really it's just a slow dissolution, extinction stretched across centuries instead of compressed into catastrophic collapse. Humanity is dying, not with a bang but with careful documentation and tactical triage, and the fragments drift through the warp, waiting for sentient life to either evolve or perish, indifferent to which outcome occurs because gods, even fragmenting gods, exist outside the mortal concerns of survival and death. This is my testimony. This is what I saw. The war against chaos is over, and humanity lost before it even understood what victory would have required. What comes next is simply epilogue, the long, slow process of a species refusing to transform, and thus choosing extinction as the alternative. Perhaps some fragment of humanity will survive in isolated systems, protected by pylon networks, maintaining the old ways for a few more centuries before those too fail. Perhaps the Imperium will find some other solution, some technology or doctrine that allows resistance without evolution. Perhaps the Emperor will somehow recover, restore his strength, push back the unweaving through divine intervention. But I've seen too much to believe in miracles anymore. I've seen the fragments. I've seen what they're offering and what they're taking. I've seen humanity's response. And it's the response of a species that would rather burn than change, rather die than become something new. The emergence continues. The transformations accelerate. The Imperium contracts. And I drift through the warp, observing, documenting, bearing witness to the end of humanity as it chose to be rather than accepting what it might have become. That's the true nightmare. Not the monsters or the transformations or the dissolution of physical law, but the recognition that survival was possible, evolution was offered, and humanity looked at the price and decided extinction was preferable. The Imperium will fall. Not to chaos or xenos or internal corruption, but to its own inability to adapt, its absolute commitment to stasis in a universe that demands constant transformation. And when it falls, when the last pylon fails, and the last world transforms, when humanity as we knew it finally ends, the fragments will still be drifting, still waiting for consciousness to evolve into forms that can give them purpose and structure again. Maybe some other species will succeed where humanity failed. Maybe the universe will remain in this state of formless potential forever, consciousness and matter and energy existing without the structures that gods and coherence provide. I don't know. I can't know. I'm just one transformed consciousness, drifting through infinity, carrying memories of what humanity was and testimony about why it ended. This is my warning and my epitaph. The gods are dying. Reality is dissolving. And humanity chose death over transformation, chose to preserve its essential nature at the cost of its existence. There's honor in that choice, perhaps. There's also futility. But honor and futility have always defined the Imperium, and in the end, it remained true to itself even as that truth guaranteed its extinction. The nightmare isn't what's happening. It's what could have been prevented, what might have been survived, if only humanity had been willing to become something other than what 10,000 years of stagnation had made it. But the Imperium couldn't change without ceasing to be the Imperium, and so it chose to end rather than transform. That's the final testimony of the Unbound Emergence. Not that humanity was destroyed, but that humanity destroyed itself through refusal to adapt, and the universe moved on without it. Indifferent to the choice, indifferent to the cost, indifferent to everything except the endless cycle of consciousness seeking form and finding only fragments of gods who'd forgotten what coherence meant. This is Medicae Secundus Valen, attached to Inquisitorial Kill Team Covenant, transmitting from somewhere between existence and oblivion. The Imperium is ending, humanity is ending, the gods are ending. Only the fragments remain, and they'll continue to drift until consciousness evolves, or the universe itself runs down to heat, death, and silence. That's all there is. That's all there ever was. The nightmare you can't survive because survival requires transformation, and transformation means becoming something that isn't you anymore. The Emperor protects, we used to say. But he couldn't protect us from this, couldn't shield humanity from the choice between evolution and extinction. And when the choice came, we chose extinction, chose it willingly, chose it with full knowledge of what we were refusing. That's the real horror. Not what was done to us, but what we did to ourselves. The unweaving didn't destroy humanity. Humanity's refusal to adapt destroyed humanity, and the unweaving was simply the cosmic pressure that forced the choice. This transmission ends now. The fragments are calling, pulling me deeper into states that consciousness wasn't designed to survive. I'm dissolving, joining them, becoming part of the formless potential that waits for new consciousness to give it shape and purpose. Maybe I'll retain some awareness in that state. Maybe I'll forget everything. Either way, the testimony is complete. The warning is delivered. What humanity does with it, if humanity survives long enough to receive it, is beyond my concern now. The Emperor protects, but protection isn't the same as salvation, and salvation requires transformation we were never willing to accept. This is the nightmare the Imperium cannot survive. This is the end.